This video is entitled Donald Trump, Psychoanalytic and Historical Perspectives. It was originally made on October 4th, 2020. All the presenters here are contributors to the book Psychoanalytic and Historical Perspectives on the Leadership of Donald Trump, co-edited by Michael Maccoby and me, Ken Fuchsman, published by Routledge this May. The book is available from Routledge and national online booksellers. Each of the authors presenting in this video wrote a new piece for this occasion. I hope you enjoy it. Dr. Mcabee is a psychoanalyst and anthropologist whose book, The Gamesman, was a New York Times bestseller. He specializes in studying narcissistic leaders. His article, Narcissistic Leaders in a Harvard Business Review, earned a McKinney Award. Donald Trump actually quotes Dr. Mcabee on narcissism in his book, Think Like a Billionaire. Dr. Mcabee, you have 25 minutes.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you for organizing this. I'm going to speak with the thought that although President Trump is ill now, I'm going to assume he will be recovered. Meanwhile, his campaign continues to promote the same idea. So I think it's important still that we understand him and understand why he is a clear and present danger. And to answer that question, I'm going to cite remarks by people who have worked in the Trump administration and left it. Former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, General Mattis, wrote, "He does not try to unite the American people. Instead, he tries to divide us. At a time with a great amount of cultural division in the country, he has made it worse." Donald Trump himself has said to Bob Woodward, "I bring out rage." And he brings out rage from his supporters in a way which increases the divisions in the country. Former Chief of Staff in the Department of Homeland Security, Miles Taylor, "I came away completely convinced, based on firsthand experience, that the president was ill-equipped to do his job effectively. And what's worse, he was actively doing damage to our security." Former Vice President, the representative for Vice President Pence on the coronavirus task force, Olivia Troe, "He doesn't actually care about anyone else but himself and has shown a flat out disregard for human life." I mean, even in the fact that he has had meetings where people have not worn masks, have infected each other, is an illustration of that. Former Intelligence Director Dan Coates, "He doesn't know the difference between a truth and a lie." Former personal lawyer Michael Cohen, in his book, "He is a cheat, liar, fraud, bully, racist, predator, and con man." President Trump is responsible for millions of people losing health care insurance at a time of pandemic, causing the loss of thousands of American lives. His policies of deregulation threaten the environment. I think that's enough to say he's a clear and present danger. The question is, further, what will he do to try and disrupt the election? What will he do if he loses? Will he try to discredit it? What will he do if he wins the second term? Continue to provoke culture conflict, continue to attack our democratic institutions, voting rights, the free press, given that he is a clear and present danger to our country. I think it's important to understand his personality. I do this in a way, I'm not diagnosing Trump, and I'll come back to that later. Talking about understanding, that means understanding his motivational type, temperament, type of intelligence, and very importantly, his philosophy. I'll come back to all of these. First of all, I do not think he has a narcissistic personality disorder. He has cited me, as Ken noted in his book, Think Like a Millionaire, saying that my description of productive narcissists like Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos fit him, that he is a visionary. I don't think that's correct. Jobs and Bezos created value with their products, wanted to change people's lives for the better. Trump's productions have been glitter, have been gambling, very different. I don't think he belongs in that category. I thought a lot about his personality, and I came to the view that his motivational system is a combination of marketing and narcissistic. Since this view of Trump's personality is different from the common views, just describe Trump as a narcissist. I think it's worth elaborating on the understanding the marketing personality. Eric Fromm first described this, and he could have been describing Trump. A marketing person's self-worth and identity depend on how he is evaluated by significant others. Quote, his prestige, status, success, the fact that he is known to others as being a certain person are a substitute for a genuine feeling of identity. The situation makes him utterly dependent on the way others look at him, forces him to keep up the role in which he had once been successful. And Fromm wrote that for the marketing person, other people are experienced as commodities, like himself. The difference in people is reduced to merely quantitative difference of being more or less successful, attractive, hence valuable. Only when the marketing individual is successful does he feel valuable. If not, he feels worthless. The insecurity which results from this orientation can hardly be overestimated. If someone feels one's self-worth is not constituted primarily by the human qualities one possesses, but one's success on a competitive market with ever-changing conditions, one's self-esteem is bound to be shaky. Constant need of confirmation by others, neediness. The marketing orientation also determines a way of thinking, quote, of grasping things quickly so as to be able to manipulate them successfully. For manipulative purposes, all that is necessary to know is the surface feature of things, the superficial. The truth to be uncovered by penetrating to the essence of a phenomena becomes an obsolete concept. Trump constructed a persona of narcissistic grandiosity as a defense a marketing image of omnipotence. He fine-tuned this over 14 years in The Apprentice. That is the grandiose image he presents, which his base identifies with. How did he develop this marketing image? What do we know about his childhood development? We learn a lot from Mary Trump's book. We can imagine his attachment was hard, anxious, avoidant due to an absence of mothering at the time, feeling of lack of love. However, as Mary Trump points out, his needs and vulnerabilities were seen as a weakness. He had to be a tough killer to please his father. He had to create this image. This was the beginning of developing a marketing image. He had to repress any soft or caring feelings as he built grandiosity as a defense. What about his intelligence? I think the people who are close to him characterize him as a smart, street smart salesman. Jared Kushner says he's expert at reading people's tells. That's a concept from poker. You can tell someone when someone's bluffing. He adapts to the media world. Kushner says he plays the media like a fiddle. He has a superficial understanding that's characteristic of the marketing personality. He also has a aesthetic orientation, studies of leaders who have an aesthetic orientation. See, these leaders want to see everything as beautiful in terms of their particular taste. Trump is that way. He wants a beautiful wall. He wants people to look good. And typically, leaders with an aesthetic orientation distort reality. They want to make things look good. You could see that with Steve Jobs. They said he created an environment of reality distortion. Certainly that's true of Trump. His temperament, he's an extrovert. He's challenging. He's undisciplined, impulsive. John Bolton writes about his decisions being very impulsive, not thought out, just based on what he thinks will get him reelected. He's resilient. He bounces back from his bankruptcies, and he's working to bounce back now. Now let's get to his philosophy. I think psychologists typically underestimate the importance of philosophy. Two people may have the same motivational system. They may both be narcissists, but one has a philosophy that's humanistic, and another has a philosophy based on power. Say FDR and Hitler both had a narcissistic motivation. But look at how different they are in terms of their philosophies. FDR, at the start of his presidency, said in these days of difficulty, we Americans everywhere must and shall choose the path, social justice, the path of faith, path of hope, the path of love toward our fellow man. Contrast that to Trump. Philosophy is winning is the most important thing. Fighting back. Positive thinking. He is a student of Norman Vincent Peale, and the book of positive thinking, Power of Positive Thinking. He cites that, and the view that people are commodities. Some valuable, others are worthless. Rather than a narcissistic personality disorder, I would say he has a moral philosophy disorder. Very different. Keep in mind, we all have a philosophy. That's what brings our personalities together. As William James started out in his famous essay on pragmatism, quoting G.K. Chesterton, he said, a landlady is more advised to know a renter's philosophy than his bank balance. And James went on to say, we all have a philosophy. It's the most important thing about us. Now, what about his leadership behavior? I repeat again, this grandiose image appeals to his base. This is something that's why he continues with that. He continues to repeat the things that gained him success. He obviously needs affirmation from the base. That's why he must have these large gatherings. The affirmation there, he plays to the populism, racism versus the progressive. What we're seeing today, we talk about a cultural conflict. We've had great strides, progressive strides in the empowerment of women, of a greater understanding of Black empowerment, of gays and transvestites, all getting more rights. A real change at the same time that we've seen this cultural change. We've seen a change in the nature of work to more information. Some people are able to thrive in the new information economy. Other people fall back. They don't have the skills. They don't have the abilities. They're still in another world. They're still hoping to be back in a lost America. And particularly Trump appeals particularly to the white traditional people who have become his core, his base. They identify with him. They love him. They believe he loves them. Furthermore, his behavior is gaslighting. We're going to hear more about that from Dr. Stern and Dr. Logue. He has been able to keep the traditional right conservatives with him, because as long as he chooses the judges they want, tax cuts they like, the deregulation that particularly helps the fossil fuel industry, they'll go along with all of his other things, even though they often say they don't approve of him. they recognize that he is giving them the key things they want, and that also that his base is very powerful in any primary, and they can't run against it. He, as a administrator, he sets general policies and lets everyone else do the actual work. John Bolton points out, as long as he gets the credit, he lets his assistants carry out things. And as Bolton said, every decision based on getting reelected. Now, what has his reelection strategy been? I think we've seen it. We saw it in the debate. Fire up the base, bring out rage, boast about the economy before COVID-19, although the COVID-19 undermines his whole economy boast. And he has, even to keep the economy going, he will sacrifice people for the economy. Emphasizing law and order, exaggerating threats from the left, and refusing to criticize threats from the right. Define Biden as a puppet of the far left, try to upset him in debates. Trump is clear and present danger. Biden has faults, but he's a caring person, and he is a better alternative. With that, I will conclude.
The next scheduled speaker is Liz Lunbeck. Elizabeth Lunbeck is a professor of history at Harvard. She has written this valuable book called The Americanization of Narcissism, another book called The Psychiatric Persuasion, and she's edited some books as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Lunbeck. I'm a contributor to this book, and I am recording this contribution after the fact because I had to miss the original conference due to illness. I hope that this will be a satisfactory substitute. I teach in the History of Science department at Harvard, where I'm a professor, and I have written on narcissism and some on narcissism and Trump. Several years ago, I published a book called The Americanization of Narcissism. So several years ago, I wrote that the question of how Donald Trump managed to appeal to a broad enough swath of the American populace to win the presidency in 2016, how this would engage commentators of all stripes for years to come. How, I asked, can we explain his improbable appeal, phenomenal ascendancy, and continuing imperviousness to critique? Well, it's now 2020, and we are still asking that same question. Every day, we read of his immovable base, made up of some 40% of the nation's populace, unmoved by the latest insult, misstep, outrageous claim, and cascade of lies. My answer was to look at the question through the lens of narcissism. And my argument then, boiled down to its essentials, goes like this. Trump mobilizes his own narcissism, evident in his charisma and grandiosity, as well as in a primitive inner world characterized by rage and envy. He mobilizes this to connect to his followers and to affect their willing submission to him. Many have pointed to the bonds he has forged with his supporters, which have yielded him as a master exploiter of opportunities afforded by a rapidly changing media environment. They've yielded him a constant stream of adulation. Trump, in turn, has held out to his loyal enthusiasts the promise of participating in his greatness. The deal struck many of the nation's disenfranchised and aggrieved has sworn allegiance to this larger-than-life figure who they feel understands them and their struggles. They have been unfazed by his performance in office, notably his occupying rather than draining the Washington swamp, and they continue to declare their unwavering support of him to puzzled print and television journalists. I don't propose that psychology alone can account for Trump's rise. The authoritarian populism that he exploits has been sweeping through Europe and the world, challenging the hegemony of established parties and undermining liberal democratic traditions and institutions in many places. Much of the commentary on Trump rightly stresses both economic factors such as globalization's failure to deliver on its promise of benefits for all, resulting in a devastated Rust Belt and decimated cities, and political considerations such as the failure of liberal democracy and the weakness of its institutions, political parties, the press, the judiciaries. These factors laid the groundwork for Trump's rise and go far towards explaining it. But I suggest it's also the case that our concepts and categories are proving inadequate to the task of explaining the intensity of the connection Trump has forged with his enthusiasts. Even those who, as one said many years ago, know that Trump doesn't give a shit about me or almost anyone else. This connection has confounded journalists from the beginning of his campaign and continues to do so. His supporters don't care that his relationship with truth is shaky and opportunistic. They don't care that he trades in anger and hate and that he invited violence against his enemies. They don't care that he has admitted to sexual assault. The difficulty in explaining Trump and his appeal lies in the fact that he has prevailed not despite but because of all of his lies, anger, contempt towards losers, intolerance of dissent, and bombastic grandiosity. His flouting of just about every political, social, and sexual norm has only enhanced his appeal to his devotees. His narcissism is a resource for and not an impediment to his electoral success. Today, I'm going to look at the subject of what I'm inelegantly calling followership by taking a deep dive into an exemplary case of the leader-follower relationship, the case of Michael Cohen, Trump's former personal attorney and all-around fixer, as it emerges from the pages of his recent remarkable tell-all book, Disloyal, a memoir, the true story of the former personal attorney to the President of the United States. This may seem a somewhat improbable choice, but I'll get to that in a moment. First, however, just a few more words on the topic of narcissism. The question of Trump's narcissism and whether professionals can diagnose him from afar without running afoul of ethical guidelines is hotly debated in scores of newspaper articles. Trump's behavior, his public behavior and temperament certainly conforms to psychiatric descriptions of pathological narcissism, and many have diagnosed him as such or even relatedly as a psychopath or a sociopath. Trump's grandiosity, entitlement, craving for admiration, exploitativeness, and lack of empathy are readily grasped. By these DSM criteria, Trump is a living, breathing textbook of character disorder, meeting just about every criterion in the literal book. Characterizing Trump as character disordered can help us understand the relentlessness of his need to prevail over everyone and everything. It highlights the paradox of his manifest worldly power, wealth, real estate, women, and now the most powerful office on earth, on the one hand, and his insecurities and overweening fear of humiliation on the other. It calls attention to his primitive need for adoration and approval, as well as to his impulsivity and, when thwarted, uncontrolled rage. Yet none of this can help us understand why anyone, let alone 60 million plus American voters, would be drawn to such a repugnant individual. Grandiose, entitled, devaluing, boastful, exploitative. What is the attraction? The DSM character disorders can account for why people might fear Trump and his vindictiveness, the negatives of his character, but cannot explain why anyone would flock to him with the sort of abject devotion one can see in his followers. that is, the positive, appealing aspects of his character. The press coverage of Trump has focused almost entirely on the downsides of his narcissism. The result has been that his appeal has become ever more bewildering and apparently inexplicable. I argue that to understand Trump's drawing power, we must turn to psychoanalysis and the conceptualization of narcissism it sustains. Analytic narcissism is organized around the paradoxes that many of us find difficult to grasp in the actual person in the flesh of the narcissist, chiefly between a charming, glittery presentation on the one hand and absolute ruthlessness on the other, between apparent need for admiration of others on the one hand and contemptuousness towards them on the other. Most significant, highlighting the narcissist's sometimes considerable charisma, this analytic perspective is organized around the nature of the relationship between leader and led. That is, what is at issue is not so much the leader's personality, but rather the way he mobilizes that personality to connect with his followers. This construal of narcissism is dynamic, contrasting depth and surface, outer and inner, observed behavior, and inferred inner states. It is also relational, best understood and captured only in the narcissist's connections with and treatment of others. Okay, so now to discuss Michael Cohen and his best-selling memoir. This may seem a bizarre choice on my part, but I will contend that Cohen, who has no formal psychological training, is possessed of an acute psychological sensibility, and that he is versed in the ways of malignant narcissism, alert to its allure and contradiction, as are few others. A quick reminder of who he is. Cohen was Trump's personal attorney from 2006 through 2018, and in 2017-2018, he served as deputy finance chair of the Republican National Committee. Convicted of fraud and perjury, he is a disbarred felon who wrote his book while incarcerated in Otisville Federal Prison in New York State. You may recall that he was released in May 2020 due to COVID-19 to serve out his sentence under house arrest. He was returned to federal custody in early July after being spotted violating the terms of his house arrest. And then, after complaining that his rearrest constituted interference with his right to publish his book, he was once again released. Since his book has come out, he has been roundly criticized in the media, harshly judged for his faux penitence, for profiting from his association with his former soulmate, and for being a sap and admitting to harboring, quote, a lot of affection, end quote, for the morally bankrupt president who so monumentally betrayed him. It hardly bears noting that Cohen is not your standard expert on narcissism. Yet, his account offers us the opportunity to probe what I've identified as among the most enduring puzzles of Trump's political hegemony. His remarkable capacity, despite all of his amply documented flaws, to bind others to him and to elicit from them a steady stream of admiration, a capacity that continues to elicit amazement nearly 4 years into his presidency. Many have diagnosed Trump as a pathological narcissist, but no one has delved more instructively into this often overlooked dimension of that narcissism than has Cohen. I've long been intrigued by a snippet from a paper by the British object relations theorist Herbert Rosenfeld, published in 1971 in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, in which the subject of the mafia comes up. The paper represents an early exploration of what Rosenfeld called destructive narcissism, what we might know now as malignant or pathological narcissism. The paper appeared around the time when the concept of narcissism was garnering attention and gaining traction broadly within American cultural criticism and within psychoanalysis. The paper focused on the split-off aggression Rosenfeld saw in cases of destructive narcissism. He wrote that the destructive narcissism of some of his treatment-resistant patients often appears, quote, highly organized, as if one were dealing with a powerful gang dominated by a leader who controls all the members of the gang to see that they support one another in making the criminal destructive work more effective and powerful, end quote. The purpose of the organization, which he likened to the mafia, is to maintain its power, quote, to prevent the weakening of the organization and to control the members of the gang so that they will not desert the destructive organization, end quote. The organization seems, he went on, quote, to have the purpose of maintaining the idealization and superior power of the destructive narcissism, end quote. That is, the patient's inner world was run by a tyrannical outfit that offered protection at the cost of complete loyalty and submission to the boss. Rosenfeld's paper has been cited 500 times in the analytic literature, included by Otto Kernberg, but it was slow to catch on. Within 15 years of publication, it garnered only 15 citations. More significant to my knowledge, the portrait Rosenfeld paints of the narcissist inner world governed by a mafia-like organization has been treated largely as metaphorical in any of the invocations of it. In Cohen's hands, I want to propose this powerful metaphor and way of envisioning the narcissist's inner world assumes a frightening, but also for our purposes, quite useful reality. Surely, I thought as I read Cohen's book, it is worth exploring that a memoir written in the idiom of the mafia and riven through with notions of threat, menace, and compulsion on the one hand, and blind loyalty on the other, has succeeded where other accounts have failed in capturing the dynamic of dominance and submission that characterizes the relationship of successful pathological narcissists and their followers, a relationship that has proven elusive and resistant to conceptualization. Cohen's account brings Rosenfeld's paper vividly to life, and it lends it renewed urgency. In Rosenfeld, the destructive narcissist inner world is run by a criminal enterprise devoted to maintaining the subject's hold on power and his sense of superiority. In Cohen's memoir, what was in Rosenfeld's telling enacted metaphorically and in the patient's internal world, as well as in an analytic dream space, in Cohen's memoir, this is reenacted on the stage of real life, assuming terrifying and destructive shape. The world in which Cohen lived for more than a decade as Trump's self-described consigliere, and at least in my heart, adopted son, mirrors in many suggestive ways the dynamics seen in the inner world of Rosenfeld's subject. My speculative contention is that Cohen graduated from his long stint at the center of the Trump organization, governed by a mafia ethos and modus operandi, with a graduate degree in pathological narcissism. His insight into narcissistic dynamics is hard-won and quite remarkable. His account is lively and psychologically astute. His perspective is both that of an insider, he tells us he became, in effect, Trump's mental double, and an outsider, taking the fall for the man he called boss, prompted an internal reckoning. The book represents his attempt to come up with an answer to the question of how he could have surrendered himself to a man he more than once called a mobster, even as he knows what he is doing is ethically wrong. Here I'll focus on three dimensions of this question. First, Cohen as self-described mobster, asking whether this has equipped him to grasp relations of dominance and submission in ways that others have not been able to. Second, excitement, identification, and merger in Cohen's portrait of Trump's aphrodisiacal allure. And third, Cohen's insightful and psychoanalytically astute understanding of Trump. First, I would like to propose here that Cohen's insight into the dynamics of narcissism is related to, or more strongly rooted in, his long immersion in the ways of the mafia. He flaunts this immersion throughout the book, writing of himself, for example, quote, "I was 100% made man," end quote. His uncle ran a catering hall and mob hangout in Mill Basin, Long Island, where the teenage Cohen first experienced what he called the charisma and the specific kind of energy of the wise guys who hung out at the club. They were gangsters, Cohen writes, and the sense of fear that people felt around them, that I felt around them, was very powerful. They were knitted together by, quote, a strong, ruthless tribal loyalty that underwrote the ability to do whatever they wanted, damn the consequences. The aura of menace mixed in with power and money and governed by the imperative of loyalty, this aura of menace that Cohen experienced among these murderous men, he found once again in the Trump organization. Recounting his recruitment into that organization, he senses that Trump, who he quickly begins to call boss, is testing his, quote, fealty and submissiveness, the way a gang leader tests a new recruit, end quote. Threats, menace, destruction. These Cohen quickly discerns, constitute Trump's theory of political and personal life. Cohen finds he enjoys inflicting harm and exercising power, and finds Trump's order to, for example, rough someone up to be something like a mobster that he, of course, carries out. Cohen reveled in his role as Trump's fixer. Is he Michael to Trump's Don Corleone? He eventually envisions himself Trump's son. I have become a New York gangster lawyer working for the organized crime Don, he writes. Mob speak is Cohen's preferred register, an idiom testifying to his insider status, his favored position, his bona fides in the criminal enterprise that was the Trump organization. And I'll return to the construct of organization later in this talk. Second, Cohen, owning up to his desire to flatter Trump, as well as to the pleasures of his own servility, takes the reader directly into the heart of Trump's appeal in the way that I've not seen elsewhere. He narrates his journey into the belly of the beast as a saga of seduction. At the outset, he experiences a jolt of excitement, moment of pleasure, admitting to finding the man exciting, enthralling, irresistible, intoxicating, and thrilling, even as he terms his own debasement out of control. This mix of enticement and glitter, destructiveness and ruthlessness he feels when in Trump's presence reads to me as if straight out of Otto Kernberg's landmark 1975 treatise, Borderline Conditions and Pathological Narcissism. Here, Kernberg homes in on the charming, engaging surface of the malignant narcissist undergirded by coldness and ruthlessness. The narcissist's glitter is often considerable, but beneath lies object relational emptiness. Cohen progresses from feeling Trump's power in an emotional register to feeling it physically, even viscerally. He identifies with Trump from first meeting with him, admitting, quote, I thought I was possessed of some of his best qualities. Trump's aggression is exciting, and his admiring gaze is a powerful elixir that prompts Cohen to abandon any moral compass for the delights and magnetic pull of the man he calls boss. The boss's praise is an aphrodisiac. The attraction to him is physical. Merger fantasies with the powerful object take root. Cohen writes variously that he gave up control of his mind to Trump, that he'd become Trump's ventriloquist doll in relation to him, and that the two were experiencing a pleasurable mind meld to the extent that they breathe in unison, finish each other's sentences, and somewhat oddly share the same contact list on their synced mobile phones. Quote, I was becoming Trump, writes Cohen, in a process that was at the time immensely pleasurable and intoxicating, but that is, in retrospect to Cohen, the bloom off the rose, shameful, embarrassing, and somewhat inexplicable. Cohen mobilizes the language of addiction in his attempt to explain his submission. He was a junkie, he writes, mainlining the excitement and mirroring Trump's idealizing of him. He admits that Trump filled some deep longing and need within, and credits Trump with possessing an eagle eye for sycophancy, to the extent that Cohen finds himself working for free for the much richer boss. And in the literature of narcissism, you can find this grooming of marks so as to rely on them down the line for narcissistic supplies. Cohen knows in some way that all of what Trump offers is a lie, that he's living in a Trumpian fantasy land. How does Trump lure people into this fantasy land of wonder and excitement and power and intrigue and adulation? In part, it's threat. The price of not complying is complete banishment, speaking to a fear Cohen sees among Trump's Republican colleagues of being left on the outside. But it's just as much Trump's, quote, animal magnetism. Fear and pleasure cemented Cohen's ties to Trump. Within the Trump bubble, the larger-than-life boss was a mystical figure in possession of, quote, the urgent and only truth, the chance for my salvation and success in life, end quote. Only later does Cohen realize that he was, quote, totally out of his mind. Third, Cohen rarely mentions Trump's narcissism, although he does call him a narcissistic sociopath, invoking his grandiosity, need for adulation, and heedless exploitation of others. But it's the more subtle observations he makes that I'd like to highlight here. Trump has no friends. This harkens back to the earliest narcissists in the analytic literature who live in splendid isolation. He preys on others and constantly demeans them because he's riven through with envy. In fact, in one of his more striking observations, Cohen suggests that Trump's hatred of Obama was rooted in his envy of Obama's accomplishment. Envy figured prominently in the makeup of the malignant narcissism. Cohen characterizes Trump as a rage-filled character, a dimension of him that hasn't received adequate attention. And he gets something fundamental about the nature of Trump's inner world, writing that, quote, Trump projects his own sins and crimes onto others, partly to distract and confuse, end quote, which many in the Twitter sphere know well, but mostly because he thinks everyone is as corrupt and shameless and ruthless as he is. Kernberg has said basically the same thing in 1975. Speaking of pathological narcissists, they also experience other people as basically dishonest and unreliable. I find this a remarkable insight on Cohen's part, suggestive of an intuitive, if basic understanding of object relations theory. Parenthetically, Kernberg writes that the narcissist, others, idealized people on whom they seem to depend regularly turn out to be projections of their own aggrandized self-concepts, which offers some clues to the ways in which narcissists invite, then repudiate merger, an experience with which Cohen was painfully familiar. Where does all this leave us? In conclusion, I'd like to reiterate my contention that Cohen's account takes us deeper into one version of narcissistic object relations than just about any other account I've seen. Of course, what is salient is not just the way he was drawn in, but also the way in which his relationship to Trump, in his own telling, functions as a simulacrum of the nation's, or at least of Trump's followers' fealty to the president. Cohen is searing on the ways in which Trump channels resentment, embodying, quote, an entire portfolio of ambitions and desires and resentments for countless people, including me. Trump invites identification. Cohen's identification was so powerful, he imagined himself actually part of Trump. And Trump strategically deploys such preferences as fast food and trash TV and leering at attractive women, as well as aligning himself with the world wrestling entertainment to perform his working class bona fides. That is, he's a master of inviting identification. A second takeaway from Cohen's memoir is that fantasy is just as powerful as reality. This would be a basic psychoanalytic precept, and I think you can see it played out in Cohen's memoir. Even though he's working for nothing, he feels as if he is getting everything from this powerful, idealized other. And third, in sum, and in conclusion, to return to the issue of Cohen's identification with the mafia, I really think there's something in this, that what we are dealing with is an organization and not a collection of symptoms. Much of the popular discussion of Trump's narcissism has been in the register of a DSM symptom checklist. And what I've tried to argue here is this is inadequate to accounting for Trump's appeal. It can account for the negative sides of Trump, the ugliness of his narcissism, but it can't begin to account for what really matters, which is how Trump mobilizes his narcissism to bind other people to him. So is Cohen an intuitive object relations theorist by virtue of his understandings of the ways in which all the parts of the organization, the Trump organization, or in Rosenfeld's terms, the internal world organization of the narcissist, in which all the parts are mobilized to support the continuing idealization of the boss? Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Robin Stern. I am the author of The Gaslight Effect, and I'm happy to talk with you today about gaslighting, from the personal to the political. I'm sure many of you recognize the term. It's been pretty popular since the election cycle in 2016. Fortunately, we will not have to live it anymore, certainly as a strategy of our administration. But lest I get too political right away, let me just jump into the subject matter. What is gaslighting? It's a form of manipulation that seeks to sow seeds of doubt in a targeted individual or members of a group, hoping to make those targets question their own memory, perception, and sanity. And in 2018, as a result of the election cycle and the many times that administration and nation leaders were called gaslighters, it was the second runner-up for the most popular word in the Oxford English Dictionary. The gaslight effect is a term that I coined to describe what happens to you when you begin to second guess yourself because you've allowed someone to define your reality and erode your sense of self, your confidence, and your judgment. And it happens over time. It's not a one time somebody tries to manipulate your reality, you let them, and you are suffering the gaslight effect. No, it happens in stages over time. What are some warning signs that you're being gaslighted? Well, you can read them on the screen. You're constantly second guessing yourself. You ask yourself, am I too sensitive a dozen times a day? Or am I too crazy a dozen times a day? Or am I too anything a dozen times a day? You often feel confused and crazy in your relationship. You find yourself ruminating, going around and around and around and trying to sort out the reality. You're always apologizing. You can't understand why you aren't happier. Many people who are in gaslighting relationships have so much materially that you may even have a lot of friends. They may even have a lot of success in their careers. And yet there's something that is soul killing about somebody trying to play with your reality, trying to undermine your reality, that leaves you very unhappy in the midst of what otherwise looks like a happy life. You frequently make excuses for your partner's behavior. You know something's wrong, but you just don't know what it is. You know that you're not crazy, Somewhere inside, deep inside, you know you're not crazy, but you just can't get out of what feels like quicksand after a while. You start lying to avoid put-downs and reality twists. You say, no, I didn't. Actually, the place was out of salmon, rather than say, you know what? I didn't get the salmon, I forgot. Because you don't want your partner, as similar to the husband that I wrote about in my book, accusing his wife or insisting with his wife that she didn't love him, that she didn't think about him, that she wasn't caring about him because she didn't get the salmon he wanted. You have trouble making simple decisions. Well, that's pretty easy to think about the reason why that is. When you're activated, when your emotions are running at high intensity, you can't think straight. You can't access the part of your brain that is responsible for good decision making. You don't recognize yourself. And this is something that I've heard over and over from people. I'm just not the same person I used to be. I don't know. I used to be so strong. I would never let anybody talk to me that way. I would never let anybody put me in a corner where my reality was not reality. And you wonder if you're good enough. Am I a good enough wife? Am I a good enough sister? Am I a good enough mother? Am I a good enough friend? Am I a good enough daughter? Sound like anyone you know? Sound like anything you've ever felt? Think about it. Gaslighting and the Gaslight Effect in particular has 3 stages. The first is disbelief. One of the cases I wrote about in my book that I think is very a good illustration of the stages of gaslighting is my patient was walking down the street, and she, with her husband, was one of the cases that I wrote about in my book. In fact, let me just see if I can read a passage from it. Katie is a friendly, upbeat person who walks down the street with a smile for everyone. She went through a long period of dating before she finally settled on her current boyfriend. Brian can be sweet, protective, and considerate, but he's also anxious and fearful. When they go out on a walk together, Katie is outgoing and talkative, easily falling into conversation with the man who stops to ask her questions or the woman whose dog cuts across the path. Brian, though, is full of criticism. Can't she see how people are laughing at her? She thinks that they like these casual conversations, but actually Brian says they're rolling their eyes. And in fact, when people stop to ask her directions, Brian accuses her of flirting with those people, or they're flirting with her. So initially, in disbelief, she's like, no, of course that's not happening. That's silly. And that's the first stage. You hear a remark. Somebody says something that sounds like, what? No, you can't really believe this. And so you ignore it and you go on. But just like Katie, after weeks of relentless criticism, she began to think, gee, maybe I'm not really aware of what I'm doing. Maybe people are rolling their eyes. Maybe people are laughing at me. Maybe he is flirting with me. And that's how she moved into the second stage. The second stage is when you defend yourself and you're insisting, no, I'm not really flirting. He's not flirting with me. I'm just a friendly person. That's just the way I interact with people. And then your boyfriend, like in the case of Katie and Brian, insists, no, that's not the case. Can't you see how you're looking at him? Can't you see what he's doing? Can't you see how he's looking at you? Can't you see that they're making fun of you? And you find yourself more and more passionately insisting that your side is right, that he's wrong, and that you're right. That goes on. And you find yourself ruminating over and over and over, completely exhausted from the power struggle. But you can't let go because you are equally bought in to his thinking well of you, to insisting that he sees your reality. So while he's trying to twist your reality to become his reality, you're trying to insist and can't let go of wanting him to see your reality. And I know I'm using him to point to the gaslighter. And honestly, in my practice over 30 years, most of the cases I saw were a woman coming in, and not surprisingly, more women seek out therapy, or have in the past anyway, and talking about their gaslighting spouses or boyfriends. Sometimes parents and friends as well, of course. And gaslighting can happen in any pairing. But in this talk, most of the pairs I'm going to talk about are either husband and wife, or boyfriend and girlfriend, or some kind of couplehood. And then the third stage is depression. Like the patient Melanie I described earlier, who was completely devastated when she came home from the grocery store, knowing that her husband would basically tell her that she didn't know what she was talking about, that she was, obviously, if she loved him, she would have gotten him the right salmon, and went on and on and on, was seriously depressed when I met her. Felt like her life was devoid of joy, and was crippled by the thought that he was probably right. Because after all, if she did love him, she would have gone to the grocery store early. Maybe she would have gone to 5 grocery stores. Isn't that true? If she really loved him and really wanted him to have the salmon, she would have made it happen. So gaslighters can look like any of us, right? They can look like the person who is charming and sends flowers all the time, and is completely upbeat and charismatic and sweeps you off your feet and makes you feel like you're the most important person in the world. Or they can look like the nice guy. They can look like, whatever you want, honey. I'm going to accommodate you. I just have a couple of questions. It's fine, whatever. Even-tempered, nice personality. Everybody likes him. And then, of course, there's the intimidator, the guy who is just out and out bullying you, could be cursing, could be on the brink of violence. And obviously, that's the scariest profile of gaslighters. Let's take a look at the movie that inspired the title of my book. It's called Gaslight, and it's a movie made in 1944 with Charles Boyer playing the husband and Ingrid Bergman playing the wife. This couple met each other while she was taking singing lessons as a young girl, having been orphaned by the death of her aunt, who she was living with years after her parents left or died, and they don't tell you that at the beginning of the story. And Gregory, her husband, played by Charles Boyer, was a charismatic music teacher who pursued her, and they quickly got married and fell in love, and now they're living back together in the home she grew up in with her aunt. And what the audience knows, but she does not know, is that he looks like a very suspicious character from the onset. And in fact, he stole her aunt's jewels while she was alive, and is looking now for more jewels to steal, in particular one of the large gems that her aunt wore in a concert. And so he wanted to move back to their house, and here they are living in their house. So let's see what happens, and then I can go on with the story. Okay, so you can see in that in the movie. So you can see in the movie that the first suggestion that Paula is forgetful is in the stage of disbelief. Don't be silly, Gregory. Of course I'll remember. But little does she know, of course we know, that he's stealing her, whatever it was he gave her, the brooch, excuse me, and so when she empties her bag at the end of the night, of course she doesn't find it because he's stolen it. And then, of course, he leads her to believe that there's something wrong with her, which is why she didn't find it. And because of the movie, it's only a couple of hours as opposed to over a period of months, because of his insistence, because she is confused and exhausted from looking for it and from thinking about, could I have possibly lost it? She begins to think, well, maybe I did. Maybe I am forgetful. Maybe I'm exhausted. And so that's the beginning in the movie of Gregory insisting that she's crazy and she's ill and she needs to stay inside and not see any friends, and more isolated and more devolving through the stages of the gaslight effect. And in today's culture, with so much uncertainty, with our stress levels off the charts because we're living in a world that is unpredictable, uncontrolled, we're personally out of control, and we don't know when it's going to end. And we have so many confusing signals. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask. Wear a mask, but our leader's not wearing a mask. Wear a mask, but stay 6 feet away anyway. And you can't eat inside. Well, maybe you can eat inside if there's 25% occupancy and there's going to be a vaccine, but maybe you shouldn't take the vaccine because vaccines need trial. And maybe there's going to be school, but maybe it's going to be virtual. So when there's a lot of uncertainty, and especially over a long period of time where our stress is high and we're depleted and exhausted, it's fertile ground for gaslighting. Because you're looking for some reality. If somebody knows a reality and you don't, well, it may be easier to push it forward in that context. The gaslight tango is my term to describe how we buy into it. So here's an example. If I say to you, hey, you didn't save me a seat at the lunch table yesterday, or in the dining room yesterday, and are you mad at me? And you say to me, mad at you? Come on, you're so sensitive. If I respond back and say to you, you're right, I am sensitive, but you still didn't save me a seat, are you mad at me? If I don't buy into it, I'm not gaslighted, even though you did try to manipulate my reality. Whereas if I say, oh my God, you're right, I'm so sensitive. It's my fault for being so, or it's my responsibility that I'm so over the top about the fact that you didn't save me the seat. We're on our way to your knowing then that you can use this tactic, this strategy, this manipulation to not have to answer my questions, to avoid taking responsibility, to deflect the conversation onto me. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Sound like some of your patients or some of your friends, or maybe something that happened to you? The gaslight tango is about the fact that it takes two to participate in gaslighting. And of course, who are the players in gaslighting? It's the person who is the more powerful person, who engages in an ongoing systematic knocking down of confidence of the target of the gaslightee, sowing seeds of doubt in his or her reality. And the gaslightee is the less powerful person. Really does involve that power dynamic, even if there's no real world power. But you've given the person the power to define your reality. And in order for you to keep the relationship going, you allow that knocking down. Just like in the example I gave, you allow somebody to say, you know what? It's because I'm too sensitive that I'm even thinking about the fact that he didn't save me the seat. And over time, without that reality, you experience a shaky sense of yourself as you begin to question and doubt your own perception. So when I was writing my book and I interviewed many people who were working, women who were mental health workers or leaders of group homes for battered women, they all told me that gaslighting and manipulating somebody's reality is far worse in terms of its long-term effect than somebody smacking someone across the face or even beating somebody up, which of course is horrendous. But when you are black and blue, you can point to the monster in your life and say, that person did it to me, and you can begin to heal, and you can stay away. But when we experience this shaky sense of self, this ethereal feeling of I don't know what's wrong, and a poor lessening of our self-esteem, all too often we point the finger at ourselves, because where's the evidence? There's no real evidence. Nobody did anything that you can point to, right? Until you name it as gaslighting. So the gaslight tango, why do we stay in it? Well, we have a tremendous need to merge. And I don't mean that in a psychoanalytic way. I mean that in the way I've been describing, where we need to feel like we're on the same page. Women particularly get into this mode with their gaslighters, where it's really important that they can please them. If they are pleasing them, then it means they have to see them in a good light. If they have to see them in a good light, they have to join their reality. And also, of course, the fear of the apocalypse. What's the apocalypse? Well, anything that you fear. So if you're afraid the person will not love you anymore, will withdraw, will abandon you, if you are afraid that the person will hurt you physically, if you're afraid the person will somehow ruin your reputation or try to hurt your reputation or keep you from your family, those are things that can keep you in line, that can keep you in the relationship, even when the gaslighting is getting pretty bad. And then there's the empathy trap. Also, a part and parcel of dancing this gaslight tango, where you're trying to figure out what's going on his side. Why would he say that to me? Like, no, he couldn't possibly really say that to me. He couldn't really think that. After all, he really loves me. So the empathy trap is when you're standing too long in someone else's shoes, trying to figure things out from his side. And when you're trying to figure things out from his side, both of you are in his shoes. And so there's nobody standing in yours, nobody looking at your boundaries, nobody protecting you. And the explanation trap, very easy to have that kind of positive reframing about every single situation. And at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, we talk about reframing all the time as a positive emotion regulation strategy, as a way to say, well, you know what, maybe she isn't trying to like get out of her responsibilities on this project. She's just going through a tough time. Reframe, telling yourself a different story about what's happening in order to have a more positive spin. And I always say when we present that as a strategy, because it is an effective strategy, and there's nothing wrong with giving people the benefit of the doubt and extending goodwill and thinking, you know what, they have the best intentions. But when it's a repeated pattern over time, or when it doesn't feel right at some center of your being, then you're trying to explain away bad behavior, and you could be stuck in a gaslighting relationship. So I wonder if people could take a minute now just to make it personal, whether it's something you see in your practice, whether it's something that you've experienced in your life. No, I'm describing it in very simple terms, as opposed to a more deep psychoanalytic interpretation. But I think somehow that can be very effective, because when you can name something, then you can address it. And the simpler we can make it, the easier it is to spot. The easier it is to have a practice every day of keeping your life gaslight free. So we'll get to that piece as well. And of course, what makes you vulnerable to this? Part of it is our nature, our temperament. Some of us are just naturally more sensitive and respond to hurt, whether it's physical or psychological, with a greater intensity. Some of us are shy and introverted, not the same thing. shy and or introverted. Some people are more outgoing and heartier and non-gregarious, not shy at all. And each one of our temperaments makes us a little less or a little bit more vulnerable to gaslighting. If you're introverted and you're spending a lot of time getting information from yourself, maybe you have one set of vulnerabilities, the way you talk about things to yourself. If you're outgoing and you're used to getting all of your feedback from the outside world and your stability from those social engagements, you're looking to your gaslighter for something that you may never get, or that you may get only when you agree with them. And then there's nurture, of course. People aren't born gaslighters. So either you saw it, or you experienced it, or you happened into it and it worked. So nurture is the way you were raised, the environment you were raised in, and the influence of all of those things on who you are and how you behave. And it may not be that you liked it, it's just that maybe that was the only way you saw that somebody got to control a moment interpersonally, where he or she lost stability, internal cohesion, and had to right themselves by using a technique that's called gaslighting. I love this. So my flight attendants are not only my internal feelings and sensitivities, but my friends. So what do I mean by that? When you fly in a plane and you are worried that that something may be wrong, what do? You look around and you look to the flight attendants. And if the flight attendants are sitting and they're relaxed, or they're just continuing to serve drinks or dinner, you sit back in your seat and relax. Same thing with gaslighting. When you feel like there's something wrong, check in with your flight attendants. They'll tell you. So what are some flight attendants you can rely on? Well, dreams. If you're suddenly having bad dreams, if you used to dream and you suddenly aren't dreaming, if you're having trouble sleeping, what are your flight attendants? Mine is an uneasy feeling in my stomach and maybe a tightness in my chest at times when I'm in an interaction where I think, this doesn't feel right. The idea or the beginning of that kind of ruminating can be a flight attendant. Like, wait a minute, that is a signal. That flight attendant is saying something's wrong. Or your friends, check in with your friends. Wait a minute, what do you think about this? Do I seem like me? Are you noticing anything? I'm worried because something doesn't feel right in my relationship. Please tell me, what do you see? Who are your flight attendants? And can you check in with them when you feel like something's off? So we've talked about what is gaslighting, what is the gaslight effect, what happens over time when you're being gaslighted, what are the types of gaslighters, what are the stages of gaslighting, what are the warning signs of gaslighting, what are the conditions of vulnerability, and what are some of the traps that keep you in gaslighting. So let's spend a minute now on, can you stop the gaslighting? The answer is yes. It's not easy. In fact, it's very hard if it's a really core dynamic between the two of you. But before you can even think about stopping, you've got to be willing to leave, even if ultimately you don't have to. Because if you name it and you share what you know, and you share how you feel, and you share the impact of it on you, and nothing happens, what do? Unless you're willing to leave, you won't be able to take back any of the power you've given away. That said, sometimes you don't want to leave because it's a family relationship and you want the gaslighting to stop, but you're certainly not leaving. So what do? Well, in that case, if you decide there's gaslighting and you try to stop it and you're not willing to leave, take distance. Find whatever excuse you can to take distance. In order to stop the gaslighting, you need to do a lot of positive self-talk. It's one of the most well-researched emotion regulation strategies. And as you all know, whether you're treating people or you're experiencing it yourself or you're listening to your friends, when somebody is trying to destabilize you, it is very hard to hold on to a mindset that says, I can do this. I'm okay. I'm not crazy. This is gaslighting. And if you don't feel it deeply, you can fake it till you make it. You can say the words, I can do this, even if you don't really have 100% conviction that you can do it. Some things will help you, like opt out of the power struggle. As much as you want to stay in, and as much as you want to insist that the person understand that you're a good person, that you're not really too sensitive, that you're not going to be crazy every time they don't save you a seat, you have to opt out of the power struggle. You have to you don't have to do anything, but if you want to stop the gaslighting, opt out of the power struggle, because you cannot be gaslighted if you're not engaged in the back and forth. You can feel something and then you can work with yourself, but you're not going to actively allow yourself anymore to be undermined by being in that power struggle. Write down the conversations you're having, just in the same way that I told that story. Where did the conversation about the seat at the table veer off into blaming me for my sensitivity? When did it become my responsibility or my fault even? When I was simply asking a question, are you mad at me? So at some point it stopped becoming a responsive conversation back and forth, and it just shifted into, let's talk about you and what's wrong with you. In a gaslighting relationship, generally your gaslighter has triggers, whether it's money or relatives, or those are two popular ones, or sex, or anything else that is triggering your gaslighter. You're being gregarious, his being possessive and jealous. I worked with a patient years ago who told me that her boyfriend wanted her, when they were walking on the street, to keep her head down so she wouldn't see anyone she knew, so she wouldn't ever have to say hello to anyone and distract from their conversation. And she came into me, and I decided to do something paradoxical. And I said to her, well, that sounds like a good idea. I mean, if you're walking on the street and you keep your head down, then you don't have to ever look at anyone. What do you think about that? And somehow when I said it to her, she said, well, that sounds crazy. Right? But that was a trigger for him. So she decided she wants to stop the gaslighting. She's just not going to take any walks. Right? And lost my train of thought. Let's see. Talk to people you really know. Yes. Focus on your feelings. Talk to people you really know and who really know you, and ask them, do I seem like myself? Or are you noticing any changes? Because people will tell you, no, I haven't seen you in 6 months. We used to see each other all the time. I'm not talking to you. You never mention your marriage. Is everything okay? And focusing on feelings as opposed to what's right or wrong. In a personal relationship, it's more important. The way you feel is more important than who's right or wrong on a particular subject, always. And then in deciding whether to stay or go, ask yourself these questions. Can I act differently with this person? Is he capable of acting differently with me? Even if the gaslighting stops, is he really capable of being a partner with me? Am I willing to do the work that it might change to change my dynamic? And that's a big one, because it may be that for a while you're saying this is called gaslighting. You're doing it again. I'm not going to be having this conversation with you. Opting out of the power struggle. This is what this is. I can't deal with it anymore. Having a cup of tea. If I give it my best effort, will I be happy? Or will the relationship be not the one I want? Important questions. So why did I re-release the book in 2016? Or actually, I think it came out in 17 or 18, but I started to write it or rewrite the intro and rewrite the culture piece because suddenly gaslighting was in the news. between the time that I wrote my book in 2007 to the re-release many years later, just going to look up the date of the re-release right now, in 2018. There are increasing numbers of blogs about gaslighting. Dating and self-help blogs talked about it all the time, but the importance of standing up to your gaslighter. I was interviewed many, many times about gaslighting. I was interviewed many times about gaslighting in the workplace. Gaslighting was defined on Wikipedia. I read you the definition when we started. And in 2016, John Oliver catapulted gaslighting into consciousness. And he tweeted, or he responded on social media to the claim that Donald Trump had been invited to his show. So he said, I never invited Donald Trump to be on my show. Donald Trump apparently had tweeted out something about, I don't want to be on that show with John Oliver. And he said, but I never invited him. But in the back and forth on social media, Donald Trump insisted so many times that he was invited. In fact, he said he was invited multiple times, and he said no multiple times. And John Oliver said that he was so thrown off by Trump's insistence that he asked his producers to go back into the archives and just to double check to see whether or not Mr. Trump had in fact been invited. And of course, he had never been invited. So I was interviewed a lot around that time about whether Donald Trump was a gaslighter and whether and what is gaslighting. And then, as I said, gaslighting was the runner-up behind toxic for the most popular word in 2018. And it is very popular now. I've been interviewed and people have written articles interviewing other people besides me in CNN, Teen Vogue, Salon, Fox Media, Huffington Post, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and dozens more. And I think we can all agree that we're living in a culture where whether or not you think the administration is gaslighting us, people are talking about it all the time. It's become part of our popular discourse. Whereas in 2007, it was the rare case that people were talking about gaslighting. And so when I rewrote my book, I thought about whether the tenets of gaslighting, the participation in the relationship, was something that would hold up in a gaslighting situation where the president may be gaslighting you, or somebody in the administration, or somebody who runs your workplace, who you never really had a relationship with because you work 3 tiers down. So what happens when someone is trying to gaslight you writ large, right? Or gaslight us, or gaslight a group? While you may not be actively participating with that person in the gaslighting tango, you are participating when you begin to let go of what you know to be true. So you know, because you've listened to the science, for example, that wearing masks is good and protective. But then you hear someone who is an important authority saying, you don't have to wear a mask, or they're misleading you, or the science doesn't matter. And if you cannot hold on to your knowing that the science matters, or investigate further, maybe you don't want to deny, okay, could I be wrong? Maybe you don't want to give up the possibility that you can't ask yourself something again. Check it out, accumulate more facts, go to the sources you trust, and be in the present with your own reality. So when you hear somebody saying something that counters your reality, name it then. Wait a minute, I'm being manipulated, or I'm being asked to give up my reality. Being asked to give up my reality. And mostly, to keep your life gaslight free, take very good care of yourself. Sleep, eat, move your body so that you're healthy. Be an emotion scientist. Be committed to curiosity and openness, to not judge yourself or others. Gaslighters are not bad people. They just have very bad habits. I guess some may be bad people, but they have learned this strategy of controlling the moment and helping themselves feel whole at your expense. Practice self-regulation strategies like positive self-talk. And most importantly, practice compassion for yourself. Include yourself in the circle of people you care about and take care of. And about gaslighting culture, it's up to each one of us to find the sources of news we trust, the analysis we can rely on, and the facts that will hold up under scrutiny. None of us can do that alone. We need the experts, and we need our flight attendants. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Judith Logue, a psychoanalyst. She has contributed one of the chapters on gaslighting to the book that Michael Maccoby and I have co-edited. She has leadership positions in a variety of psychoanalytic groups, and she has some very interesting things to say. You've got 25 minutes, Judy.
Okay. Before I talk, I want to express my dismay about criticizing President Trump when he is ill. The term gaslight originated in the 1938 British play Gaslight and became best known in the United States through its 1940 and 1944 film adaptations, both titled Gaslight. The term then became popular with the public. Most significant for our profession is that the term is now used in clinical psychological literature, as well as in political commentary and philosophy. My own education and training are in government and psychoanalytic psychology, which is the reason the topic of gaslighting in the field of psychohistory interests me. Robin advanced the meaning of gaslighting by using the term gaslight effect. She defined gaslighting as the systematic manipulation of another's reality with the unwitting cooperation of the victim. Gaslighters insist that their versions of reality are true. Consequently, gaslight victims begin to believe this is so, and some doubt or question their own memories, perceptions, or judgment. A gaslighter is either a person or a group of people who covertly embed seeds of doubt in a targeted individual or group. With denial, misdirection, contradiction, and misinformation, gaslighters destabilize the victim and delegitimize the victim's beliefs. Instances are lying that previous abusive incidents occurred, belittling the victim's emotions or feelings, and staging bizarre events intended to disorient. With this in mind, I shall discuss my book chapter, Gaslighting, the Personal to the Political, a Psychoanalytic and Psychohistorical Perspective. Trying to understand the partisanship and polarization in our present cultural conflict is really a plea for objectivity. Equally important is an updated perspective on why we have elevated a leader who is authoritarian, whose words and actions make no sense unless we apply psychoanalytic insight and understanding. Even then, it still may not make sense, which is why Ken and Michael have published their book, Psychoanalytic and Historical Perspectives on the Leadership of Donald Trump, Narcissism and Marketing in an Age of Anxiety and Distrust. It is why we are discussing this topic today. The term authoritarian or autocratic leadership is a style of leadership in which the individual in charge takes control of decisions. There is little accepted input from members of the group. Typically, authoritarian leaders make choices that are based on their own judgments and ideas. They rarely accept advice from followers. Authoritarians assert absolute control over a task or group. I do not know President Trump. I have not evaluated him in a thorough psychiatric interview in the way I was trained as a senior clinician at Rutgers Medical School. I'm a PhD psychoanalyst, so it is essential to clarify that I talk as a psychoanalytically informed citizen who is concerned about the authoritarianism and distortion of facts in today's culture. I also want to emphasize that my own psychohistorical perspective can be applied to anyone with power who uses lies and deceit to manipulate and fool others for personal gain or unsavory purposes. Some of these are public figures, or perhaps even people we know or who are close to us. I am not suggesting a psychiatric diagnosis of President Trump. He is unique, and as he himself would appreciate, he defies conventional diagnoses. Gaslighting has caused confusion. Like many people, mental health professionals and others, I have for several years tried to make sense of that which makes no sense, at least on the surface. Why do we seem obsessed or addicted to writing, reading, talking, and channel surfing for the latest words and actions of Donald J. Trump? Why do the media respond every minute and hour in an effort to filter facts and not be drawn in by distorted information or propaganda? Some of us are vulnerable to oversimplified, anger-filled diatribes, especially when faced with uncertainty and rapid social change. Others want more than psychological terms such as malignant narcissism, marketing narcissism, gaslighting, psychopathy, and sociopathy. Some people require more than a history of a leader's personal developmental traumas. They now want more than assertions that supporters or politicians have sold their integrity and morality, their souls, for power from President Trump. They even want more than the explanation of gaslighting as a psychodynamic double bind prevalent in borderline psychotic interactions that causes people to feel, if not act, unreasonable, upset, enraged, panicked, irrational, or what we call crazy. The current wave of populism has taken us beyond gaslighting. People everywhere want change for the better. Questions and some answers. Were we to more fully acknowledge our own unanalyzed narcissism and I want what I want when I want it wishes, what Freudians call our id desires, that include lust, power, hate, retaliation, envy, competition, and even sadism, we might be better able to stop the clear and present danger of authoritarianism. What is wrong and or right with us that as individuals and as a nation, we apparently want and need a would-be dictator who lies and who is a master of the media and an Elmer Gantry of politics? Why do we not yet know how to stop or limit partisanship and polarization, gun and other violence, and promote a more reasonable and safe society? So far, one answer I have is that we insufficiently acknowledge, apologize, and make amends for our own socially and personally unacceptable, unconscious wishes to have it all. Now, not later, to be protected, to be taken care of, and unaccountable at the same time. I believe that we analysts must first educate ourselves more deeply, in addition to teaching and helping others, to acknowledge the denial and projection that are the downsides of an amygdala and limbic system that are necessary to help us fight predators and keep us alive. Then, in the traditions of ego psychology, self-psychology, relational analysis, modern conflict theory, and even cognitive behavioral theory, we must endeavor to expand the executive function of the ego in ourselves. We benefit when we consider mindfulness techniques, spirituality, and religion too. Until or unless we change our increased psychosocial amorality and immorality and stand for racial and gender equality, democracy will continue to wither. Unless we change internally as well as externally, an age of integrity will not replace our age of psychopathy and sociopathy. Can we make America greater than ever? Equally important to heal America, we must work harder to understand, as Michael and Ken are doing, the reality and psychohistory of President Trump's disgruntled base. I believe this base is the cause, not just a symptom, of the unsuitable president we have today. Ken's and Michael's excellent discussion of examples of a disenfranchised base of Republican supporters demonstrates that many of them feel deprived of their essential rights, privileges, and benefits. Are liberals also a cause of our culture of conflict when we deny or dismiss what conservative voices want us to hear and to understand? Liberals view President Trump as a puppet agent and representative of the values and schemes of others. In a polarized society, liberals and progressives also feel disenfranchised. President Trump is a skilled showman, salesman, and marketer of conservative values that favor military spending, free market capitalism, deregulation, states' rights, private health care, gun rights, and traditional socially conservative values, despite the fact he does not care about them at all and even ridicules them, according to those who have been close to him, like John Bolton, Michael Cohen, and Mary Trump. Reportedly, his primary goals are money and personal power, and he is a man who Cohen says is consumed by power dementia. To many of us, Mr. Trump does not have the intellectual and psychological depth to be credible. He operates by instinct and impulse. He distracts to avoid criticism or responsibility. He promotes chaos. As Bob Woodward concludes, after hours of in-person interviews, he is the wrong man for the job. Yet President Trump, while wearing a long red tie, does swing quite a gaslight, which he uses to illuminate the weaknesses, flaws, and vulnerabilities of his victims, so he can eventually publicly exploit them with sadistic pleasure. Among gaslighting and dangerous examples, these stand out. The Corona-19 virus is a hoax and will disappear. It hardly affects children. Hydroxychloroquine and even drinking disinfectant bleach may prevent and cure the so-called China virus. A number of people were actually poisoned following this idea, gaslighting supreme. It reminds me of Jonestown, where followers of Jim Jones drank cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. President Trump contradicts, humiliates, and attacks reputable scientists and government health organizations, Dr. Anthony Fauci, CDC, and the FDA. Defying presidential norms, he promotes fallacies and tweets denigrating rants at all hours of the night and early morning. According to General James Mattis, he submerges victories with a mercurial, capricious tweeting form of decision making. President Trump tries to stop testing during the pandemic. His goal is to demonstrate fewer cases so he will look good. Most important is his intent to win re-election by showing that he has conquered the virus. He says testing makes us look bad, but it is good to have. Over and over, he gaslights the public with double messages. More recently, President Trump threatens he will refuse to abide by the constitutional requirement for a peaceful transfer of power if he is not re-elected. Reporters interviewed supporters who are convinced that Mr. Trump is right, that the election will be rigged if he were to lose. Past attempts without accountability to con others for personal gain cause fear and concern. Michael Cohen details how he paid off people in mafioso style. These are examples here in America. Others affect the rest of the world. President Trump alienated our NATO allies despite disagreement of General Mattis and the military. He withdrew from the World Health Organization. He denied climate change in the midst of dangerous fires, another reordering of reality and pretense that it is a hoax like the pandemic. President Trump discounted our intelligence agencies and relied on the words of Putin that there is no attempt to influence our elections. Thus, he is himself a student and victim of gaslighting by a master. In a speech to veterans, President Trump said, "What you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening." Within the past 24 hours, in his gaslight style, President Trump contradicted his chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Mr. Meadows told reporters, "The president's vitals over the last 24 hours were very concerning, and the next 48 hours will be critical in terms of his care. We're still not on a clear path to full recovery." Soon after, Mr. Trump phoned Rudy Giuliani from his hospital bed and declared he feels so healthy. He said, "I could get out of here right now." Assuming he recovers from his illness, he is likely to reassure us he is a winner for beating the Chinese flu. So I end where I began. Gaslighters insist their versions of reality are true. Consequently, gaslight victims begin to believe what is untrue, and some doubt their own memories, perceptions, and judgment. In conclusion, some options to preserve democracy and stop gaslighting techniques. A natural concern is what options are there to preserve democracy and stop gaslighting and authoritarian techniques. Some scholars believe that success requires a focus on policy, issues, and accurate journalism, instead of personality and tabloid news. They believe credibility increases when we find points in common, not just differences. To provide free publicity with ridicule and to deny legitimate successes usually backfire. But I believe we also need to elevate psychology and psychohistory, character, personality, temperament, motivation, and defenses, and the psychology of our leaders have long been ignored as if they are irrelevant or unimportant. We have paid dearly for this omission. Strategies from recommendations for individuals can be modified for systems and groups. First, as Robin recommends in her book, be ready to act, not just respond. This means acting against psychopathic and sociopathic modes of functioning. Second, stand firm for democracy and against what Ken calls the abandonment of civility. Third, enact all legal and ethical methods to expose, then stop criminal, racist, hateful, and violent behavior individually and structurally. And finally, change our institutions and political system when they are corrupt or outdated, which Brian D'Agostino asserts are major impediments to democracy and to racial and gender equality. So I conclude that we have opportunities for progress in this age of cultural conflict. I also conclude that by definition and in my psychohistorical perspective, our president is a gaslighter supreme who represents a clear and present danger to our country and also the world. Thank you.
So I will substitute at the last minute something that I recently wrote on Donald Trump and the 2020 pandemic that is not and is also about gaslighting, and this will appear in the next issue of the Psychohistory News, and it's called Donald Trump in the 2020 Pandemic. So here is my paper. In May 1918, a 49-year-old father and his 12-year-old son were taking a stroll in Queens. Suddenly, the parent felt sick. Within 2 days, he died of the Spanish flu. A century later, his grandson was president of the United States. The 1918-1919 pandemic in the US took the lives of 675,000 Americans. In the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, the US has seen the loss of over 200,000 Americans. In the Spanish flu, 1.35% of worldwide deaths occurred in America. Globally, the US has 20% of all COVID-19 deaths. The number of coronavirus cases in the European Union and US in March 2020 were nearly parallel. By June 20th, though, European nations were reporting 1/8 of the number of cases as reported in the United States. Many EU governments early on took decisive, effective action to contain the coronavirus. The American national government did not. President Trump's conduct in the pandemic is the subject of this paper. The first inkling of the coronavirus came in December of 2019 from China. By January 30th, 18 countries had cases of coronavirus. Trump made an effort to restrict travel in the United States with China in January 31st, yet people from infected nations in Asia and Europe kept entering the US. In February, 70,000 legally came in from China and 1.88 million from Europe. On March 9th, Trump announced a travel ban for European countries. But by March 1st, 59 countries had reported coronavirus cases. The US was on its way to a major public health crisis. Yet Trump publicly played down the danger of the disease. On February 2nd, he proclaimed that we pretty much shut it down. 8 days later, he predicted it would go away in April. On February 26th, he announced that the 15 current US cases within a couple of days is going to be down close to zero. As the virus continued to rapidly expand, on April 10th, Trump predicted the fatalities in the United States will be substantially under 100,000 lives. All these claims were untrue. With the dangers mounting, Trump's scientific advisors and others pushed him to do more. On March 16th, he established national guidelines for 15 days that recommended people work and go to school from home, avoid situations with more than 10 people, don't do unnecessary travel, don't go to bars, restaurants, and public food courts. The president said, with several weeks of focused action, we can turn the corner and turn it quickly. When he made this statement, there were 1,678 COVID-19 cases. At the end of March, we had 140,000 cases. Trump extended the guidelines until the end of April. On April 30th, we had 1,003,974 cases and 52,000 deaths. Clearly, Trump's declaration of quick progress was wrong. The principles he established had little chance of curtailing the disease's speed. He did not propose to implement the Defense Production Act to combat the rapidly spreading lethal virus. He left most of the efforts up to the states. Still, it took Trump less than a week to start undermining his own guidelines. On March 22nd, he tweeted in caps, "The cure cannot be worse than the problem." 2 days later, he talked about having churches filled on Easter. On April 3rd, he said he would not be wearing a mask. In mid-April, he tweeted that specific states should be liberated from pandemic restrictions that their governments had imposed. The president championed personal liberty over public health. He held mass rallies and White House gatherings, often without social distancing and mask wearing. Trump was undercutting efforts to contain the virus. The results showed. Some Republican governors followed Trump's entreaties and opened up their economies and loosened social restrictions. Between Memorial Day and Labor Day, US coronavirus cases quadrupled and deaths almost doubled. Much of this surge was in states following Trump's recommendations. Even with all these fatalities, Trump did not change his policies and consistently downplayed the extent and damage of COVID-19. On October 1st, the president declared that the end of the pandemic is in sight. Early the next morning, he announced that he had tested positive for COVID-19. Later that same day, he was admitted to a hospital for treatment. Of course, Trump's inaccurate accounts of the dangers of COVID-19 are not the only times he has been untruthful in office. In his first 3 years, he made over 16,000 false and misleading statements. Dan Coates, former Republican senator and Trump's first director of national intelligence, stated about the president, "To him, a lie is not a lie. He doesn't know the difference between the truth and a lie." Cornell University researchers, after analyzing 38 million English language articles on the pandemic, found that Trump made 38% of the misinformation spread about COVID-19, which made him the largest spreader of false misstatements. What makes Trump's deceptive versions of the threat of COVID-19 perplexing is that he knew early on how dangerous the coronavirus was. On January 28th, his national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, told the president, "This will be the biggest national security threat that you face in your presidency." Trump told Woodward on February 7th that this virus is deadly stuff and more dangerous than the flu as it communicates through the air rather than touch. He reiterated that claim with Woodward on April 5th, saying that this plague moves rapidly and viciously. If you're the wrong person and if it gets you, your life is pretty much over. Yet on March 19th, he told Woodward he wanted to always play it down to avoid creating a panic. Still, Trump could have fully utilized the Defense Production Act, ordered masks, PPE, ventilators, contact tracing, be mass produced under government control. He did none of it. As Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times writes, Trump resisted masks, sidelined experts, held large rallies, denounced lockdowns, failed to get tests and protective equipment ready. Suppose he had ramped up production of masks and empowered the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to lead the pandemic response instead of marginalizing its experts. Suppose he had tried relentlessly to battle the virus as he has to build his wall. Here we are, having done none of these things, with Americans constituting 4% of the world's population and 22% of deaths. On April 5th, in a cold phone call from Woodward to the president, the famed reporter pressed Trump on why he had not developed a centralized national effort. Woodward said that his reporting showed officials favored full mobilization, as in the Manhattan Project in World War II, referring to the investigations that led to the development of the atomic bomb. Trump did not answer Woodward. He switched the topic, as he often does. Woodward writes, Trump did not seem willing to fully mobilize the federal government, nor did the president show any real management in dealing with one of the most complex emergencies the United States has ever faced. Being a reporter, Woodward says, I was worried for the country. Why Trump did not initiate strong action to combat the virus is the critical question. There are ideological, political, economic, and psychological explanations for this. Excuse me. In both world wars, the national government centralized activities, coordinated the successful war efforts. For reasons that are consistent with long-standing Republican disdain of government economic management, Trump resisted a coordinated national plan. On March 20th, in explaining his reluctance to fully implement the Defense Production Act, the president said, "We're a country not based on nationalizing our business. Call a person over in Venezuela. Ask them how did nationalization of their businesses work out. Not too well. The concept of nationalizing our business is not a good concept," unquote. Trump confused having the government direct and coordinate the coronavirus fight with nationalizing the means of production. Though the Defense Department uses the Defense Production Act 300,000 times a year, those familiar with the president's thinking say he sees the act as un-American. What Trump asserted is consistent with a dominant Republican dogma. Oversight and regulation of the freedom of private enterprise has been anathema to a prominent stand in the GOP from before the progressive era legislation until today. Trump is reluctant to have the national government be in charge. Reporters Zolan Cano-Youngs and Anna Swanson say that the president has repeatedly tried to deflect responsibility for the most significant crisis in American soil in decades. Using the Defense Production Act would make it clear that the government is in charge. Trump was also worried about the drop on the stock market, the rise in unemployment. He became more preoccupied with reopening the economy than combating the pandemic. In mid-April, in meeting with his scientific advisors, the president said, "I am not going to sit back and preside over the funeral of the greatest country in the world," unquote. Trump did not perceive that the once robust economy could not be restored without first containing the coronavirus. Anthony Fauci warned Trump, "There's a danger of a rebound. And the one thing you don't want, Mr. President, is to try to open up and then rebound and have to close again," unquote. Trump's response, "I don't think that's going to happen. I think we'll be fine." He made a startling prediction without asking Fauci and others to provide data on the dangers and or benefits of reopening the economy. Trump just overrode expert input. On April 16th, he announced a plan he entitled "Opening Up America Again." Fauci on Good Morning America a few days later said, quote, "Unless we get the virus under control, the real recovery economically is not going to happen," unquote. Following Trump's lead, many states announced reopening plans. And between Memorial and Labor Day, cases had quadrupled and deaths almost doubled. Trump neither acknowledged his misjudgment nor changed course. This is neither the first nor last time Trump rejected the advice of experts. As president and as a business executive, he often ignores what knowledgeable authorities tell him, in part because he has difficulty evaluating complex information and troubling findings. While from time to time Trump may confront danger, often he turns away and will not look at what is uncongenial to him. To many who served in his administration, there's also another factor. As Woodward writes, Trump has trouble paying attention, absorbing information. He goes off on tangents. Many Trump senior advisors were frustrated by the president's not responding to the facts presented to him. His former Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, said, "It is very difficult to have a discussion with the president. After a few sentences, the president would often go on a rant, which," Mattis says, "I kind of irreverently call the Seattle freeway off-ramps to nowhere," unquote. General John Dunford, Trump's first chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, quote, "Facts should be dismissed and would be off on one of those ramps that circle round and start ongoing." Given his limited attention span, some question the president's cognitive capabilities. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said Trump was a moron, and I guess I left out the word he used before that. And former economic advisor Gary Cohens said the president was as dumb as shit. Fauci said of Trump, his attention span is like a minus number. Trump, though, when preoccupied with a topic, can be extraordinarily resourceful, turning dilemmas into triumph. Still, on many occasions, he has trouble concentrating and connecting challenges with the need for systematic actions. His failure to confront unpleasant facts happened in the 80s and 90s with his business problems. He bought too many businesses, often overpaid, accumulated exorbitant debts. His businesses could not generate the income to meet his overhead. By the summer of 1990, except for retail in Trump Tower and his half share of the Grand Hyatt, all else that he owned was in the red. His debt was $3.4 billion. Trump made deals with banks to save him from personal bankruptcy, though 6 of his businesses went bankrupt. The pandemic often seems a replay of Trump's problems in the early 1890s, whereas running away from threatening facts exacerbated difficulties and led to dreadful consequences. Senator Lindsey Graham gives an additional psychological reason why the president didn't activate the national government. He said, Trump wants, quote, to be a wartime president, but he doesn't want to own any more than he has to own, unquote. While often decisive, bold, and innovative, when there are problems he cannot easily fit into familiar categories, Trump evades responsibility, kicks the can down the road, and tries to divert attention. When Trump evades accountability, avoids facts, and vacillates, he shows anxiety over being blamed. His fear of being severely criticized in large part derives from his complex childhood. As a boy, on one hand, he was the golden child, his father's favorite son. On the other, the future president witnessed the harsh punitiveness his father inflicted on his older brother, Fred. His mother, Marianne, had little patience for her unruly second son. Donald wholeheartedly sought to receive the praise and to avoid severe disapproval. And yet he often anticipates being disparaged. He remains thin-skinned, sensitive to every slight and criticism. He often internalizes the judgment of these symbolic parents and futilely tries to exorcise them from his mind by demeaning whomever criticizes him. He appears to be divided between this grandiose self, the part of him that is still a child and fearing paternal reprimand and maternal rejection, and his desire to disparage anyone who criticizes him. As such, he characteristically deflects blame and responsibility from himself. He tells Woodward, the virus has nothing to do with me. It's not my fault. Of course, his denials make things worse. So Trump specializes in discounting the harm of the virus while hundreds of thousands of Americans have died. As Nero fiddled while Rome burned, Trump tweets while mass deaths pile up. He continues his denials, diversions, and deceptions as one of the country's major American tragedies go on and has now affected him. At times, he acts as if he has total power and sometimes acts less like the commander-in-chief than the perpetual outsider without authority or accountability. These reflect his both dreading being harshly judged and that Donald Trump rejects anybody or anything having authority over him. He is an imperial self outside of any rules. What we have with Trump is the president as outlaw. He is lawless, acts as if the law does not apply to him, violates statutes, disregards congressional authority, asks foreign leaders to take actions to let him get re-election. This acting as though the laws do not apply to him precedes his presidency. At least 26 women have accused Trump of sexual misconduct. He has criminally paid off women with whom he has sex to keep them silent. As a businessman, he often refused to pay the full bill that he owed to people who had contracts with him. There were, in 33 states, court filings show a pattern of his often refusing to do what business owners said he owed them. Trump's reasons for not taking decisive systematic actions to combat COVID-19 combine ideology, his inability to listen, to deal with unpleasant facts, his failure to perceive that prosperity could not resurge without containing the coronavirus, his fear of being blamed, and his opposition to anything that tries to restrain him. Given his outlaw outsider sensibility and his cognitive challenges, it is not surprising that he focuses more on criticizing others than on performing the actual duties of his presidency. He was even tardy in initiating his incomplete March guidelines. A Columbia University study in May found that if the same American policies adopted on March 16th had been put in place a week earlier, 36,000 fewer deaths would have resulted. 2 weeks earlier, that figure would be 54,000. Woodward says the President of the United States possessed the specific knowledge that could have saved lives, and historians are going to be writing about the lost month of February for tens of years. His ideological adherence to Republican anti-government doctrine, his need for personal liberty over public health, his outlaw sensibility all contribute to his mismanagement of the pandemic. Trump took a formidable problem that might have been somewhat containable and enabled it to become one of the most deadly tragedies in American history. Still, he acts as if there is no national emergency, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and his actions are beyond reproach. But despite his denials, over 900 Americans have died of COVID-19 per day since the first case was reported, including 969 on September 22nd. Thank you.